He lost everything, his home, his job, and the wife who took the last of their money and left. Alone with his young son, the poor father decided to escape to a place where no one could find them. In the mountains, they discovered an old abandoned cabin buried under snow and time. No one believed they could survive there or start a new life. But what the father did with that cabin shocked everyone. Subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching this video from. The world had become smaller for Michael O'Connor long before he realized it. Once, there had been space in his life. The wide kitchen that smelled of coffee and pancakes on Sunday mornings, the laughter of his wife drifting down the hall, the creak of the porch when his son ran barefoot to greet him after work. But that was before everything collapsed, before the house was emptied of warmth and filled instead with silence, papers, and the slow ticking of a clock that seemed to count the seconds until ruin. He had worked for 15 years in the same construction firm, one of those solid, honest companies that built homes for other families. Two-story dreams with clean windows and shining porches. Michael was proud of his craft. He liked the scent of sawdust, the way sunlight broke through scaffolding at dawn. He was never rich, but he believed in stability, in slow, quiet work. He believed that hard hands could build peace. But when the markets turned and the firm folded, the belief crumbled like a wall with a bad foundation. He lost his job, then his confidence, and then everything that had given shape to his days. Amanda, his wife, had grown restless long before he saw it. She had always looked beyond him, beyond the modest house, beyond his worn flannel shirts, beyond his slow, deliberate ways. When the money disappeared, she didn't hesitate. Her words came sharp, rehearsed, as if she had been waiting for the cue. "I can't live like this anymore, Michael. I won't watch you drag us down." She didn't raise her voice, and somehow that hurt more. Within a week she was gone, and with her went everything of value, the savings, the furniture, the car, and every account tied to his name. She moved in with a lawyer she had met months before. They transferred the house deed while Michael was too dazed to contest it. He stayed for a while, hoping she would come back, or at least that something would make sense. But the eviction notice arrived like a cold slap. When the locks changed, he didn't argue. He packed a duffel bag, lifted his sleeping 8-year-old son Jake into the truck, and drove away into the growing dusk. They slept in parking lots and roadside motels that smelled of mildew and stale coffee. Each morning brought a new humiliation. Job boards full of "not hiring," lines at soup kitchens, glances that turned away the moment he spoke. Jake never complained. He clutched his toy bear and watched the world through fogged windows, asking only if they would see snow soon. When the first flakes came, Michael realized winter was no longer something to wait for. It was a threat closing in. Their last room in a cheap motel was lost when he couldn't pay the week's rent. They slept in the truck after that, with the heater running until the gas gauge dipped toward empty. One evening, after another failed attempt to get work on a construction site, Michael sat in the truck staring at the small sleeping face beside him. The boy's breath clouded in the cold air, and something in Michael broke. He couldn't keep driving in circles, couldn't keep pretending that the next town would be different. He needed a place where no one could take anything more from him, somewhere still untouched by the noise of lawyers, bills, and pity. Somewhere he could build again, even if it was only from scraps. The answer came in the most unlikely way, from a gas station in the middle of nowhere. He stopped there late one night, desperate for warmth and fuel. The place looked like it had been built in another century, a wooden shack with one dim light, a half-frozen pump, and a man behind the counter with a face as wrinkled as the road map hanging behind him. The old mechanic watched Michael with quiet sympathy while pouring a cup of coffee from a dented pot. When Michael muttered something about needing work, the man shrugged. "Work's dead around here, but if you're looking for shelter, there's a cabin up past the ridge, maybe 15 miles into the forest. Nobody's lived there since the 70s. Roof's half gone, but it's dry. Old family died off. Locals say it's haunted, but that's just talk." Michael looked up, the words piercing through his exhaustion. "It's still standing?" "Far as I know," the man said, sliding a folded paper map across the counter. "If you've got hands and sense, you can make it livable. You won't find much out there, though. No stores, no power, no people." Michael stared at the map as if it were salvation itself. That sounds perfect. He paid for a full tank with his last cash, thanked the man, and went back to the truck. The old map trembled slightly in his hands. Jake stirred and blinked up at him, half asleep. "Where are we going now, Dad?" Michael looked out at the mountains, black silhouettes against a sky spitting snow. "Somewhere new," he whispered, "somewhere quiet." They drove for hours through winding roads that climbed higher and narrower. The radio had long since gone to static, and the headlights cut only a short path through the swirling snow. Jake fell asleep again, wrapped in an old blanket, while Michael gripped the wheel until his knuckles went white. The forest grew dense on both sides, the world shrinking to a tunnel of falling flakes. As midnight approached, the storm thickened. Snow piled fast on the windshield. The wipers squealed against the ice. A wooden sign loomed suddenly in the beam of the headlights. Half buried, the paint faded, but still readable. "Road closed. No access beyond this point." Michael stopped. The truck idled softly, its engine like a distant heartbeat in the white silence. Beyond the barrier, the road disappeared into an endless sheet of snow. He looked at Jake, sleeping peacefully, and then back at the sign. Behind them stretched 200 miles of failure. Ahead, emptiness. He stepped out of the truck into the cold that bit through his clothes. The wind howled down from the ridge, carrying the scent of pine and frozen earth. For a long time he stood there, breathing clouds into the dark, trying to feel fear or reason or even logic. But all that remained was exhaustion and an odd, calm certainty. There was nothing left to lose. He went back inside, turned off the engine, and sat in silence. The heater died, and the chill crept in. Jake stirred again, his eyes barely open. "Are we stopping here?" he murmured. "For tonight," Michael said softly. "Just for tonight." But even as he said it, he knew it wasn't true. When dawn came, pale and gray, the snow had sealed the road behind them. The truck was half buried. Michael opened the door and stepped into knee-deep powder. The world around was silent. No traffic, no voices, not even birds. Only the wind and the distant groan of trees shifting under their frozen weight. He pulled out the paper map the old man had given him. The cabin was marked with a small black X, beyond a curve in the ridge, where the forest thickened. It wasn't far, maybe a day's walk. He packed their few belongings, some canned beans, a small pot, a flashlight, a blanket, and woke Jake. The boy rubbed his eyes, shivering, but didn't complain when his father told him they were walking. They left the truck behind, its metal already turning white under the snow. Step by step, they moved deeper into the trees, the sound of their boots muffled by the drifts. The cold burned their cheeks, but Michael felt a strange surge of purpose. Each crunch of snow was a promise, not of comfort, but of movement, of direction. By afternoon, they reached a narrow pass where the pines bent low over the path. Through the branches, he saw it, a slanted roof rising from the whiteness, half buried but unmistakably real. The cabin looked as if it had been waiting for them, crooked, ancient, with shutters hanging loose and a chimney leaning like a broken neck. Michael dropped his pack and exhaled, steam clouding his vision. "We found it," he said quietly. Jake just stared, his breath trembling in the air. "It's our house?" Michael knelt beside him. "It is now." They pushed open the frozen door, and it creaked like a voice unused for years. Inside, the air was thick with dust and rot. A broken chair lay on its side, and a family of mice darted under the floorboards. The smell was unbearable, mold and time. Yet in the corner stood a small iron stove, rusted but intact, and beside it a pile of forgotten tools, hammer, nails, a dull saw. Michael felt his heart beat faster. This was not just shelter, it was a beginning. He moved quickly, opening the few remaining windows to let in light, sweeping aside old debris. Jake gathered what little wood he could find from the porch, his small hands red from the cold. When the first fire finally crackled in the stove, the sound was like a heartbeat returning to a long-dead body. They sat close together, eating canned beans warmed in a tin cup, watching the shadows tremble on the walls. Outside, the storm howled against the windows, but inside, the glow of the fire wrapped them in fragile safety. For the first time in weeks, Jake smiled. Michael studied the flames, his thoughts heavy but steady. He didn't know how long they could last here, or what lay ahead, but one thing was certain. The world had already taken everything it could. Here, in this forgotten corner of the mountains, he would build again. Not the life he'd lost, but something simpler, truer. When he finally closed his eyes that night, the last sound he heard was the crackle of wood and the soft breathing of his son beside him. Yet even as he drifted into sleep, something stirred uneasily in his mind. Because through the roar of the wind outside, he could swear he saw, far beyond the frosted window, a faint light moving between the trees, a shimmer like a lantern swaying in invisible hands. And he couldn't tell if it was real or just the mountain testing those who dared to stay. Morning broke with a silence so complete that it felt sacred. The storm had passed, leaving the forest buried under a weight of snow that muted every sound. The cabin stood like a relic of another world, half swallowed by white drifts and framed by pines bowed under ice. Michael awoke before dawn, the fire long dead, his breath a visible mist in the frozen air. For a few seconds, he didn't know where he was. The wooden ceiling above him looked like the inside of a coffin, and the only movement was the slow rise and fall of his son's chest beside him, wrapped in a blanket near the hearth. He sat up, stretching his aching shoulders. His clothes still smelled faintly of smoke and rust. The floorboards creaked under his boots as he rose, the cold biting through every layer. Outside the window, dawn bled into the forest, pale and merciless. He pushed open the door, and it resisted, sealed by a crust of ice. When he finally forced it open, a rush of frigid air swept inside, along with a few flakes that glittered like shards of glass in the dim light. The landscape before him was both terrible and beautiful, untouched, indifferent, endless. The road they had come by was gone, erased by snow. The truck would now be a tomb of metal under the drift. For the first time since leaving the city, Michael felt a strange calm. The world had finally stopped chasing them. He spent the first hours exploring their new refuge. The cabin was small, 2 rooms and a lean-to that might once have been a pantry or a tool shed. The roof sagged under the weight of years and the windows rattled in their frames. But the walls were solid. The iron stove, though rusted, still drew smoke properly when he tested it with a scrap of burning paper. Beneath the thick dust lay signs of the family who had once lived there. A child's wooden toy car, its wheels broken, a faded calendar from 1978 still tacked to the wall, a small mirror cracked clean through the middle. Jake woke around mid-morning, his hair tousled, his voice hoarse. "It's so cold," he whispered. Michael smiled, knelt beside him, and wrapped the blanket tighter. "We'll make it warmer soon." He said it quietly, but with the conviction of a vow. By noon, he had cleared a path around the house and uncovered a pile of logs half buried under snow. Damp, but still usable. He stacked them beside the stove, fed the first flames, and the warmth began to spread slowly through the room. The sound of fire filled the silence like a living thing. Jake moved closer to it, rubbing his hands and smiling faintly. In the following days, survival became their rhythm. Michael tore down broken furniture for firewood, patched holes in the walls with planks scavenged from the shed, and fixed the roof with strips of tar paper he found in a trunk. He worked from dawn until dusk, driven by something beyond exhaustion, the quiet desperation of a man rebuilding not just a shelter, but his dignity. Each morning, Jake followed him outside, trudging through snow in boots too big for his feet, carrying small pieces of wood or nails in his pockets like treasures. He didn't talk much, but when he did, his words carried a new kind of curiosity. He asked about trees, about stars, about how long people could live away from cities. Michael answered everything he could, and when he didn't know, he said, "We'll find out together." At night, they sat by the fire eating beans from a tin or thin strips of rabbit Michael managed to trap. They listened to the wind hum against the chimney, and sometimes to the distant groan of shifting ice. The isolation that might have once terrified Michael now felt like a kind of mercy. No debts, no noise, no judgment. Only time and work, and his boy's laughter returning slowly like a thaw. But the silence of the mountains had its own kind of voice, one that whispered through the trees and made him uneasy when the fire dimmed. There were nights when he woke suddenly, certain that something had moved outside. He'd lie still listening, his heart pounding, while snow fell endlessly beyond the walls. The first time it happened, he dismissed it as imagination. The second time, he rose and looked through the frosted window. The moon was bright enough to turn the forest silver. The trees stood unmoving, but near the edge of the clearing, he thought he saw a shadow, something upright, something watching. He blinked, and it was gone. The next morning he searched the area, but found nothing except the prints of a fox and the faint trail of his own steps from the day before. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't entirely alone. He began to notice other signs. Once he returned from checking his snares and found the door slightly open, though he was certain he had latched it. Another morning, the small pile of chopped wood beside the door was rearranged, neatly stacked, almost too neatly. He said nothing to Jake, unwilling to frighten him, but he started keeping the hatchet closer at night. Despite the unease, their small world grew stronger. The cabin began to feel like home. Michael carved shelves for their few possessions, hung up old coats found in the shed, and turned an empty crate into a table. Jake found a rusted kettle and polished it until it shone. The boys' laughter became more frequent, echoing softly in the walls. The forest, too, began to reveal its pattern. Deer crossed the ridge at dawn, their hooves cracking the frozen crust of snow. Ravens perched on the roof, cawing like sentries. And every evening, the sun fell behind the western peaks in a blaze of orange that turned the snowfields to fire. But peace was fragile. One morning, Michael discovered tracks leading up to the back of the cabin. Large, deep, unmistakably human. They wound from the trees to the door, stopped there, and then turned away. The snow around them was undisturbed, meaning the visitor had come sometime during the night. His breath froze as he stared at them. Whoever had been there had stood watching for a while, close enough to touch the wall. He followed the tracks for a short distance until they disappeared into the forest. There was no sign of camp, no trail of return. The woods absorbed all evidence, as if protecting a secret. That night he stayed awake by the fire, the hatchet in his lap, listening. The wind rose and fell, and sometimes it sounded almost like breathing. Jake slept peacefully beside him, unaware of his father's fear. Hours passed. The fire died to embers. Then came a faint sound. Not the shifting of trees, not the scurry of animals. It was the deliberate crunch of footsteps on snow, slow, measured, circling the cabin. Michael held his breath, straining to hear. The steps stopped. Silence. Then a long, dragging sound, like fabric against wood. He rose quietly, heart hammering, and moved to the window. The glass was fog from the inside, but he wiped a small circle clear. Outside, nothing moved but the snow swirling faintly in the moonlight. He waited unmoving until the gray light of dawn seeped through the trees. When he finally dared to open the door, the world seemed unchanged. But just beyond the threshold, half buried in the snow, lay something small, a torn scrap of dark cloth, snagged on a nail by the doorframe. He stared at it for a long time, the cold seeping through his boots, the forest utterly still around him. The thought came quietly without drama, but it rooted itself deep in his mind. Someone was out there, walking through the same white silence, close enough to touch their lives without being seen. And the worst part was not knowing whether that presence meant danger or something even stranger, something that belonged to the mountains themselves. As he turned back to the cabin, the wind carried a single echo through the trees, the faint clink of metal against stone, like a distant bell. Michael froze, eyes scanning the horizon. Nothing. Only snow and the empty rhythm of his own heartbeat. He closed the door and slid the latch firmly into place, but he knew the world beyond the walls was no longer empty. Someone or something had found them, and for the first time since arriving, he felt that the house beneath the snow might not be theirs alone. For the next few days, Michael pretended not to notice the unease curling through his thoughts. He kept to his work, chopping wood, mending the roof, checking his traps, doing anything that made him feel in control of the life they were trying to build. But when the wind died and the forest went still, he would catch himself staring at the tree line, searching for movement where none existed. The tracks he had found by the door were gone now, swallowed by fresh snow, yet their memory remained sharp as a knife edge. He knew what he had seen: human footprints. Someone had stood there, close enough to hear them breathe inside, and then vanished into the white. He said nothing to Jake. The boy's world had only just begun to feel safe again, fragile but bright, like the first fire after darkness. To disturb that would have been cruel. Instead, Michael told him stories at night, about building bridges and tall buildings in faraway cities, about how metal and concrete could rise from nothing if a man only knew where to start. Jake would listen, eyes heavy with sleep, and whisper that someday he would build something too. That simple faith steadied Michael more than any weapon could, but the mountain had its own rhythm, one that did not care for human plans. On the fourth morning, when Michael went to fetch water from the frozen stream below the ridge, he saw the prints again, not where they had been before, but closer to the forest path leading down the slope. They were fresh, pressed deep into the powder, a man's boots, large, heavy. The stride was steady, unhurried. Whoever it was had been walking parallel to the cabin, watching but never approaching directly. Michael crouched, running his gloved hand over the edges of the tracks. The snow inside had not yet glazed over, which meant they couldn't be more than a few hours old. He followed them for a while, rifle slung over his shoulder, every sense sharpened. The trail wound through the pines across the frozen creek, and then stopped abruptly at a clearing where the snow was disturbed in a wide circle. There the ashes of an old fire were barely visible beneath a thin layer of frost, a few burnt sticks still poking through. A rusted tin can lay beside it, marked with teeth from some animal. The smell of char lingered faintly in the air, like a memory refusing to fade. Michael straightened, scanning the tree line. Nothing. The forest watched him back with cold indifference. Whoever had camped here was gone, but not far. He could feel it, that invisible attention, as if unseen eyes were tracing his every move. That night he built up the fire higher than usual. Jake asked why, and Michael said it was because the temperature would drop. It wasn't a lie, it just wasn't the truth. He kept the rifle within reach, his ears tuned to every whisper of wind. When the boy fell asleep, Michael sat by the window, staring into the pale shimmer of the snow outside. The forest looked peaceful, but he knew better now. The wilderness could wear 1,000 faces, quiet, pure, even kind, until it decided to show its teeth. Days passed. The silence deepened. Then just when Michael began to think the stranger might have moved on, he saw him. It was early afternoon, the light thin and blue. He had gone farther into the woods to check his traps, moving carefully between birches and fallen logs, when he caught a flicker of movement through the trees. A figure standing still against the slope, half hidden by shadow. The man was tall, wrapped in layers of dark fabric, a beard thick with frost. He held a rifle loosely in one hand and was watching him. For a long, breathless moment, neither of them moved. Michael raised his free hand slightly, palm out. Not in greeting, but in caution. "You out here hunting?" he called across the stillness, his voice low, measured. The man didn't answer right away. Then finally he nodded once and stepped forward a little, the snow crunching under his boots. "Just passing through," he said. His voice was rough, deep, with a trace of an old accent. "Didn't know anyone lived this far up." Michael kept his tone neutral. "My son and I found the cabin. We're fixing it up for the winter." The man's eyes flicked toward the direction of the cabin, then back to Michael. "Brave thing, bringing a child up here. These woods aren't safe. Storms, animals, old mines, things people forgot about." "We'll manage," Michael said. A long pause stretched between them. The wind moved through the branches, whispering like breath. The stranger gave a short nod, as though satisfied by something unseen. "Be careful," he said finally, and turned away, disappearing into the trees as silently as he had appeared. Michael stood there for several minutes, listening to the quiet he left behind. Every instinct told him the encounter was wrong. The man's words hadn't been a warning. They'd been a test, a way to measure who he was and why he was here. And that look, before he left, wasn't the look of a wanderer. It was the look of someone who recognized something that shouldn't be found. He hurried back to the cabin before dusk. Snow falling lightly now, the air sharp with the promise of another storm. Jake met him at the door, cheeks flushed from tending the fire. "Did you find anything?" he asked. Michael smiled faintly and shook his head. "Just tracks. Might have been a hunter." Jake frowned. "You mean like us?" "Not like us," Michael said softly. He didn't explain. That night the wind rose again. The sound of it around the cabin was almost human, a long, mournful cry that made the walls tremble. Jake slept, but Michael couldn't. He stared into the fire until his eyes ached, the flickering light carving shadows across the wooden floor. He thought about the stranger, his steady eyes, his rifle, the way he'd known exactly where the cabin was. There was no reason anyone should have come this far unless they'd been here before. At dawn, he opened the door and stepped outside. The air was still. Fresh snow covered the ground in an unbroken sheet of white. But near the woodpile, something glinted faintly in the pale light. He bent down and picked it up, a single bullet cartridge, polished and clean, the brass catching the morning sun. His stomach turned cold. Attached to it with a strip of twine was a small, folded piece of paper. He unfolded it slowly, his hands stiff with frost. The message was short, written in rough pencil. "You're not alone in these mountains." Michael's pulse thundered in his ears. He looked around, but the trees offered no answers, only silence. Somewhere out there, the man was still watching, maybe even smiling at how easily his warning had found its mark. He went back inside and hid the note before Jake could see it. The boy was humming softly to himself, feeding scraps of wood into the fire. For a moment, Michael envied that innocence, that belief that the world could still be simple. He forced himself to smile. "Good work, kiddo," he said. "Keep it going." But his mind was already elsewhere, on the rifle by the door, on the thin walls between them in the endless forest, on the certainty that they were being observed. That night, when he finally drifted into a shallow, uneasy sleep, it was the smallest of sounds that woke him, the faint crunch of footsteps outside, the whisper of snow against the wall. He opened his eyes, every muscle frozen. Through the fogged window, he saw it, a shape, faint and human, standing in the glow of the dying firelight. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. It simply watched for a long moment, a dark silhouette framed by white. Then it turned and vanished into the trees, leaving only silence behind. Michael stayed awake until dawn, the rifle clutched in his hands, the fire burning low. When the first light broke across the snow, it revealed no footprints, no trace that anyone had ever been there. But he knew what he had seen. Somewhere in that vast, frozen wilderness, someone was walking the same paths, circling their fragile refuge like a wolf testing the strength of a fence. And sooner or later he knew the fence would not be enough. The days that followed blurred into one another, a slow rhythm of snow and silence. But underneath that calm, something darker coiled. The figure Michael had seen that night haunted him as much as the footprints had. Each sound outside, each gust of wind that brushed the window, made his pulse quicken. He tried to tell himself that fear was only exhaustion wearing another mask, but the weight of it grew heavier with every dawn. The forest was watching them. He was sure of it now. Yet life had to go on. The snow would not split wood, nor would it hunt rabbits or boil water. If he let fear freeze him, it would swallow them whole before any stranger did. He began to take the rifle whenever he stepped outside, even to fetch firewood. His eyes traced the edge of the trees again and again, searching for a flicker of movement that never came. For a few mornings there was peace. The sun, pale and distant, spread weak light over the clearing. Jake played in the snow, building crooked forts with branches and stones, his laughter breaking through the silence like the sound of something human and hopeful. It was enough to make Michael almost forget the note, the bullet, the figure by the window. But peace in the mountains never lasted. One afternoon, as he returned from checking the traps, Michael found something lying near the door, a sack made of rough canvas, stiff from cold. It hadn't been there when he'd left. He looked around, scanning the whiteness, but the wood stood still, silent, pretending innocence. He lifted the sack carefully and opened it. Inside was a slab of meat, thick and red, half frozen, wrapped in paper. There was no note this time, no sign of who had left it. He dropped the sack onto the snow, heart pounding. A gift or a warning, it was impossible to tell which. He waited until Jake was asleep that night before burying the meat far from the cabin. He didn't want to eat what came from invisible hands. The next morning he found the ground disturbed where he'd buried it. Someone had dug it back up. It was then that Jake began to cough again, a dry, heavy cough that stole his breath and kept him awake through the night. The boy grew pale, his energy fading with each passing hour. Michael melted snow for water, fed him thin broth, wrapped him in every blanket they had, but nothing seemed to break the fever that came creeping in. His small face burned while his body shivered uncontrollably. Michael thought of the nearest town 2 days' walk, maybe more through deep snow. Even if he made it, he'd have to leave Jake alone, helpless, in a place that no longer felt safe. The thought was unbearable. He stayed determined to fight the sickness the only way he could, by keeping the fire alive and his son breathing. The wind changed that evening. It came from the west, carrying with it the smell of smoke, sharp, dry, and unmistakable. At first, Michael thought it was his imagination, but when he stepped outside, the horizon glowed faintly red beneath the clouds. The forest was burning. He ran to the ridge to see it better. A dark wall of fire moved like a living thing through the valley below, devouring everything in its path. The wind pushed the smoke upward, and ash began to fall like black snowflakes. His stomach clenched. The fire was still far but moving fast. If the wind turned, it would reach them before night. He sprinted back to the cabin, mind racing. He woke Jake gently, trying to mask the panic in his voice. "We have to work, buddy. Now." Together they dragged buckets of snow and melted them near the door, dousing the ground to make a damp barrier. Michael took the axe and began hacking at the nearest trees, clearing a rough circle around the cabin. He worked until his hands blistered, until his breath came ragged and hot in his throat. The air thickened, the orange glow on the horizon growing brighter. As the first sparks carried on the wind, he soaked rags in water and hung them over the windows. He could see the fear in Jake's eyes, but the boy didn't cry. He moved with quiet determination, doing everything his father told him. It was courage born not from strength, but from trust. When the fire reached the edge of the clearing, the roar was deafening. The sky turned the color of blood. Heat rolled toward them in waves. Michael and Jake huddled near the cabin, covering themselves with wet blankets. The smoke clawed at their throats. Sparks landed on the roof, sizzling out where water had frozen in patches. Michael kept throwing snow against the walls, his arms numb, his lungs burning. It felt endless, the heat, the noise, the helplessness of watching nature devour everything. Then as suddenly as it had come, the wind shifted. The fire curved, veering away, its fury drawn elsewhere. Within an hour it was gone, leaving behind only smoke and the distant hiss of dying embers. They survived, but the world around them had changed. The forest was a graveyard now, blackened trunks standing like bones against the snow. The air smelled of ash and death. Michael sank to his knees, coughing, every muscle trembling from exhaustion. Jake leaned against him, his face gray with fatigue but alive. They didn't speak. There was nothing to say. The next morning, while the smoke still drifted low across the valley, Michael saw movement among the charred trees. A figure emerged from the haze, walking slowly toward the cabin. His first thought was that it was the stranger again, the same man from before. But this time, the rifle was slung across his back, and his hands were empty. Michael raised his weapon, but the man only lifted his arms in a gesture of peace. Up close, his face was older than he remembered, lined deeply, the beard streaked with gray. "You made it," the man said, his voice hoarse. "Didn't think anyone would stay through the fire." Michael kept his distance. "Why are you here?" The stranger looked around at the ruins of the forest, then back at him. "Because I needed to know who'd be foolish enough to live where others ran. This cabin, it belonged to my brother once." He paused, the wind catching his words. "He died here, long time ago. I come back sometimes, just to see it still standing." Michael studied him, the story sinking in. There was no threat in the man's stance now, only weariness. The stranger reached into his coat and pulled out something small, an old iron key, dulled with age. "He left this behind, said it opened something under the floor. Never told me what. Maybe it's time someone else found out. He tossed the key into the snow and turned to leave. Wait, Michael said. Why give this to me? The man glanced back over his shoulder. Because you earned it. You kept the fire from taking what little remains of him. You saved his home. But remember, nothing in these mountains comes without a price. Then he walked away, fading into the smoke like a ghost returning to its grave. Michael stood for a long time, the key cold in his hand, the wind carrying the last traces of burning wood. He didn't know what to make of it, whether it was a gesture of trust or a burden being passed on. When he returned inside, Jake was sleeping again, his fever finally breaking, his small face peaceful for the first time in days. Michael sat by the fire, the key lying on the table beside him, gleaming faintly in the light. Outside, snow began to fall once more, soft and clean, covering the scars of the burned land. He leaned back, eyes heavy, feeling the exhaustion settle deep into his bones. But as he drifted toward sleep, his gaze fell to the floorboards under his boots. He noticed something he'd never paid attention to before, a faint outline, almost invisible in the dim light, where the wood looked newer, smoother, as if once repaired to hide what lay beneath. The stranger's words echoed quietly in his mind. It opened something under the floor. Michael reached for the key, turning it slowly in his fingers. Outside, the snow thickened, whispering against the windows. The fire crackled softly, the room warm and safe. But under the stillness, beneath the floor where he sat, something waited silent, hidden and patient as the mountain itself. The storm that followed the fire lasted 3 days. Heavy snow came down without pause, swallowing the blackened forest, muting the world until it seemed that even memory had been buried beneath it. Michael watched it from the window, the flakes thick and relentless, falling over the ashes of what had burned and over the small patch of earth they had fought to protect. He felt as though the mountain itself was closing the chapter, covering what had been destroyed and preparing for something new. When at last the skies cleared, the air was so still and pure, it almost hurt to breathe. The forest had changed again, stripped of its rage, left in silence and renewal. The key lay on the table, its metal dull but unyielding, waiting. For 2 days Michael avoided it, convincing himself that it was nothing, that whatever was hidden under the floor had long since lost meaning. But the thought would not leave him. He caught himself glancing at the boards near the hearth, the faint outline that the stranger's words had drawn in his mind. It was a promise and a warning at once. He waited until Jake was strong enough to walk outside again. His color returned, his energy timid but growing. The boy wanted to explore the forest, to see what the fire had left behind, and Michael encouraged it. He needed to be alone when he lifted the floor. He moved slowly, prying up the first plank with the back of his hammer. The nails came out with a dry groan. Beneath it lay a hollow space filled with dust and the smell of old trapped air. He worked carefully until he uncovered what the boards had concealed. A small iron hatch, square and heavy, its lock sealed with rust. His heart beat hard as he fitted the key into it. It turned with a reluctant click. For a moment he simply sat there, the sound echoing in his head, too loud in the still room. When he lifted the hatch, a gust of cold, stale air rose from below. A narrow set of wooden steps descended into darkness. He fetched the lantern, lit it, and began to climb down. The space beneath the cabin was deeper than he'd expected. A cellar, though no larger than a small room. The walls were of stone, the floor covered with a thin crust of ice. In the far corner stood a metal chest, its surface mottled with rust and age. He approached it slowly, knelt, and wiped the dust away. There was no lock, only a simple latch that creaked when he pulled it open. Inside lay stacks of papers, a few old photographs, and a folded map, all preserved beneath a layer of oilskin. He carried them upstairs, spreading them across the table where the light was better. The photographs showed a family, a man, a woman, a boy about Jake's age, standing outside the very same cabin. The man in the picture looked like the stranger, younger but unmistakably him. The papers were property deeds, dated decades earlier, bearing the name John Kenson. The cabin, the land surrounding it, the valley below, all of it had once belonged to the Kenson family. Michael unfolded the map next. It was hand-drawn, lines faint and careful, marking the hills and rivers of the region. Several places were circled in pencil: old homesteads, abandoned mines, hunting trails. One of the circles lay exactly where the cabin stood, labeled with 2 words, "Our home." Another, farther north, was marked simply, "The Others." He stared at it for a long time. The meaning was uncertain, but something in the simplicity of that phrase made him uneasy. He folded the map carefully and put it aside. There was no need to understand everything now. What mattered was the paper at the bottom of the pile, a legal document transferring ownership of the land to whoever found it in the event that the family perished. The words were faded but legible, the ink steady, the signature firm. It was a will. He read it twice, then a third time, hardly believing it. The land was his now, not through deceit or force, but through chance and endurance, a gift left behind by those who had built the place first. The stranger's warning echoed faintly in his thoughts. Nothing in these mountains comes without a price, yet the document was there, real, tangible, binding. For the first time since losing everything, he owned something again. When Jake came back from the forest, cheeks pink from the cold, Michael showed him the photographs. The boy studied them carefully, his eyes wide. "They lived here before us?" he asked. "They did," Michael said. "And now it's ours." "Ours," Jake repeated softly, as if testing the word for the first time. The days that followed were different. The work continued, but now it was building, not repairing. They cleared the ashes around the cabin, cut down the charred remains of trees, and began shaping logs for new structures. A shed, a small fence, a place for tools. Spring crept into the valley, slow and hesitant. Patches of green appeared through the melting snow, small at first, then spreading. The forest healed, and so did they. Michael found purpose again. His hands, once stiff from cold and fear, learned to move with confidence. He built a bench for the porch, carved shelves, repaired the roof properly this time. Jake helped with everything, proud of his strength, his small body already hardened by the mountain air. Together they planted a small garden where the soil was softest, and by summer, shoots of life began to rise from the ground. In the evenings, when the sun fell behind the peaks, they would sit by the fire outside, watching the light fade over the valley. The silence was no longer heavy. It was peaceful, alive. Sometimes they would hear distant calls of animals or the soft murmur of the wind through the trees. Once Jake swore he saw the figure of a man far off on the ridge, standing with his back to the setting sun. Michael only smiled. "Maybe he's watching to make sure we're taking care of it," he said. The months passed quietly. The cabin, once a shelter of desperation, became a true home. Michael fixed the chimney, replaced the broken windows, and added a small workshop beside the garden. He began to craft simple furniture, carving designs into the wood: a sun, a river, a mountain peak. Each piece carried a mark of the life they had built from ruin. One morning, a letter arrived by chance, carried by a park ranger who had seen smoke from their chimney and come to check on them. The man handed it to Michael without question. It was from the county office. Inside was a notice declaring that Michael O'Connor had been listed as deceased 3 months earlier. His wife had filed the report, his debts written off, his accounts closed. He read the words slowly, twice, then folded the paper and stared into the fire. He was dead in the eyes of the world, and for the first time, that truth brought no pain. It was freedom, a clean break from everything that had crushed him before. Jake asked what the letter said, and Michael told him it was nothing important. They spent the afternoon fixing the fence, the sound of hammer and laughter mingling with the rustle of the wind. That night, under a sky thick with stars, Michael carved a sign from a slab of cedar. He burned the letters carefully into the wood, with a heated nail until they glowed dark and deep. "The house that is never left." Jake watched him work, his face lit by the fire. When the sign was finished, they carried it to the edge of the clearing and fixed it to the post beside the gate. The next morning, light fell across it, turning the words golden. The boy traced them with his finger and smiled. "It really is ours now," he said. Michael nodded, resting his hand on his son's shoulder. Beyond the clearing, mist drifted among the pines, and for a moment he thought he saw a figure there, a man watching, his outline faint and still. But when the wind shifted, there was nothing, only trees and the sound of the forest waking. He turned back toward the cabin, smoke curling gently from the chimney, the air rich with the scent of earth and pine. Inside, the fire waited, warm and steady, and the small home they had rebuilt from ashes stood firm against the coming cold. The world below the mountains would never know they were alive, but here among snow and silence, in the ghosts of those who came before, Michael and Jake had found their place, a life carved from loss, a peace earned by endurance. The last house stood, not as a monument, but as proof that even at the edge of the world, a man could still begin again. And in that quiet corner of the mountains, beneath a sky untouched by time, the O'Connors finally belonged to something greater than the past. If this story moved you, don't stop here. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you won't miss what's coming next. Watch the next story right now. It's even more unbelievable. And if this video gave you chills, share it with someone who needs to see it today.